Ontario Premier Doug Ford there slamming the feds for pre-budget housing announcements that come with major strings attached for provinces and municipalities that want to access cash. The Prime Minister says he'll go right to mayors if premiers don't want to play ball.
We're also working very, very closely with provinces that are equally ambitious on housing, and ideally we'd work with all provinces if they are sufficiently ambitious on housing. We are there to be partners with them. If a province decides it doesn't want to be ambitious on housing, that's their decision. We'll work with the municipalities within that province that are ambitious.
A lot to unpack there. Who better to do that than our front bench this evening? Saeed Selvam is here. He's the Vice President and Practice Lead of Public Affairs at National Public Relations. Former Alberta MLA and Cabinet Minister Gary Marr is with us. He's the President and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. Former Interim NDP National Director Carl Bélanger is here. He's now the President of Traction Strategies. And next to him, that's Canadian press reporter Najud Al-Malise. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you. Carl, I'll start with you. The Prime Minister, this is like a week, a week into these announcements about what is going to be in the budget. Yeah. They have a very specific political strategy they're employing here. Does the provinces, push back, deflate that strategy at all, or does it embolden the Prime Minister, do you think, politically?
Well, a little bit. People don't like the fighting, but the reality is that when people have needs, they don't care where it comes from. And that's why the province who's the most likely to push back on federal interference in their jurisdiction is Quebec. And that's where the dental insurance program is the most popular in the country. There's a reason for that. People have needs, and they are looking for somebody to step up. So when it comes to this strategy, they're trying to lay it out there. We're ready to help, and the blockage is coming from the provinces, which gives them the good role in all of this, even though there's rules about these things. The Prime Minister doesn't seem to care at this point.
Why do you think that may be the case from a political perspective, Gary, that the jurisdictional issues are not really the top concern for the Prime Minister?
Well, let's start with something the Prime Minister said a year ago, which is that housing was a provincial jurisdiction. So he recognized that it was a provincial jurisdiction a year ago, but obviously he thinks that there are votes in it for him to act on this. And he is, engaged in many intrusions into provincial jurisdiction, be it natural resources or healthcare or education or, in this case, housing. Maybe it sounds like he's campaigning to be the premier of a province somewhere. But I want to make note that in Quebec, they have legislation that, my understanding is, it prohibits municipalities from dealing directly with the federal government and accepting this kind of funding. It would not surprise me to see if somebody like Premier Smith enacts the same kind of legislation here in the province of Alberta, perhaps in the province of Saskatchewan as well. I think it's notable that many of the tools as to, who actually knows best, as Premier Ford says, the municipalities themselves know where it's best. They are not about to be told, or they ought not to be told, that 60% of your city, which is zoned for R1 in Toronto and Calgary and Edmonton and Vancouver, that you can suddenly start building fourplexes wherever you want. I think municipalities should be in the position of making the decision as to whether that's prudent or not, and working with the provinces and the private sector and social agencies is the way that we should move forward on this, not a unilateral declaration. And, re-announcing a loans program from 7 years ago that has produced 11,000 houses in the last 7 years. So I think there's lots of potential for this to blow up in the face of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I would say that all makes sense, Saeed, from a policy perspective. From a political perspective, putting aside the issue of resources and kind of intrusion on provinces in that respect, on healthcare and particularly on housing, when the Prime Minister made those comments last summer, I'm old enough to remember there was a massive outcry, right? Like there was a ton of pushback that he was sort of abdicating any responsibility for the crisis that so many Canadians found themselves in. I guess the question is whether the response we're seeing this week is adequate from a strategic perspective to land the message with those Canadians that they do care.
Well, that's the thing. I think that the Prime Minister is trying to go direct to voter, direct to millennials or Gen Z or first-time homebuyers who might be in the market and feel they can't afford a house, and basically speak to them and say, look, this is what I'm doing for you. This is the amount of money we're putting towards it. This is a government that prioritizes this to the 10th degree. And we ideally would like to work with provinces, but if the provinces are not going to play ball, then we'll go directly to municipalities. The challenge with that is that while you may irritate a premier or many across the country, the municipalities, especially those that are cash strapped, might actually welcome some of that funding if they're able to accept it. Now, the thing about conditional grants and conditional loans is that provinces oftentimes offer municipalities grants or loans based on hitting certain targets and certain conditions. So I don't think that that's actually a new thing, but I think it's an interesting political strategy specifically for new voters, or ideally trying to get voters over to the Liberal Party, even though it's not an election year.
Well, I think also voters who have migrated away from the Liberal Party, Najid. And just on the bigger picture for a second, we were sort of mentioning offhand that this is the latest in a succession of announcements about what's going to be in the budget, which is a new strategy being employed by this government not to save it all for Budget Day. If you total it up, it's $23.5 billion. I spoke to Minister Jenna Sudds earlier. Does that mean new taxes? She at first said no, then backtracked on that. Is there any sort of discussion at this point about whether any of this spending becomes inflationary or works against what the bank is doing, since we're only about a third of the way into how much they're going to announce when it comes to spending?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note that $15 billion are loans, and so that money is presumably the government gets back.
Presumably.
Doesn't really... There's not much of a cost for the government on that element. The other money, we don't know on over how many years they're going to disperse it. So I would say, I don't know if we're at the point yet to talk about inflationary spending on the measures announced so far. Obviously, there's a lot of talk right now about, well, you're releasing all of these measures on housing, your agenda, and then Budget Day comes around. The focus is going to be on the deficit and what does that look like, and is it inflationary? I guess, but just to the point being made about this fight about jurisdiction, I don't think it's a bad one for the government to come out and say, hey, we want to push for all of these things for renters. We want to make sure you can know how much a landlord rented this home before you came in. And we want to do that, and the province is saying no. I don't think that's a bad fight for the government. The problem will be, though, is if in a few weeks, after all of this rolls out, nothing changes for the Liberals.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, it's like great politics for them, but when it actually, like, a rubber hits the road, is it as great politics for them at that point?
Exactly, yeah.
I just really quickly, sort of jumping off all these points, Carl, I want to get your view. We got an exclusive poll from Nanos on the way Canadians are perceiving which party can manage the government's coffers as we head into the introduction of this budget in just under 2 weeks. And they're showing a big jump in support from April 2021 to April of this year. For the Conservatives, they've gone from 23 to 35%. The Liberals have gone from 28% Canadians who thought they would best manage the government's coffers to 19%, below even none of the above. What does that tell you?
Well, that part of the messaging that the Conservatives are using is working. But you have to remember that back in 2015, when the election came around, the Prime Minister explicitly campaigned against public administration and good finance. He was really all in about these deficits, and he's delivering. And now the cycle is coming back, and this is the problem for the Prime Minister, because I don't know with the next budget, in the spending announcement we're seeing, how we can fight back against that trend. The gamble is that it won't be a voting determining issue. And that's a gamble right now.
I mean, that was the gamble in 2015, right? Gary, I've just got about 30 seconds left, that modest deficits would be acceptable to Canadians, and they, by and large, were. It's no longer really classified as modest. Do you think it'll matter in the next election?
I think it will matter, and at some point, I think that Canadians are going to say, we're being bribed with our own money, and I don't think that that's a good look on anybody. And the Prime Minister back in 2015 was saying, deficits will look after themselves. Turns out that they don't. And so being fiscally responsible, I think, is going to be, as Carl said, a key of the Conservative plank going forward.
Yeah, I guess the messaging from the Liberals, like we heard today, confident countries invested themselves. It'll be that up against a message of fiscal responsibility, it sounds like, to the Conservatives. So there'll be a lot of questions to the Conservatives about how that will work as well.